Thank you so much for the introduction. And I want to extend a thank you to the organizers of this event. It's really great to get a chance to share our research as well as to celebrate the work of our fellow graduate student colleagues. And as a graduate student, one of the things I most appreciate about an event like this one is the free food. And if you noticed from your emails that you got about the event before coming here today, we have a few options, including vegan and vegetarian ones that we can enjoy throughout the course of the talks. Now, food choices are deeply personal. They can be limited by biological sensitivities if we have them, but they're ultimately attached to larger social networks, many reflecting specific political, economic, and even ecological concerns that we might have. And today, more and more people are really trying to tackle the present-day climate crisis through food choices. And even some of you today, if you got to stop in the room next door to get some food, you might have picked a vegetarian or a vegan option given these very reasons. Now, others of you may have decided to take a deep dive into the beef or dairy-based options. And there's certainly no judgment from up here, but I can't speak to everyone else out there who very well may be emulating this very critical tea-sipping Kermit meme in silent judgment of your choices. And I joke about this, and I bring it up because over the years of my research, I've seen both these subtle, Kermit-like disagreements, as well as some really intense face-to-face arguments about what could be called the larger bovine debate. This question of should we be eating beef and dairy if it really is destroying our planet? And for many of the people I've engaged with, the numbers seem to point to an obvious, well, no, we should be distancing ourselves from this type of food. But farmers tell a very different story, and in many cases, they actually place their efforts within a larger sustainability effort, one that helps feed the world while also providing high-quality protein, as illustrated in this image here on the bottom half of this slide. What I want to show briefly today as both a historian and an anthropologist of science is that both sides of this debate depend on different types of data. And the collection and interpretation of that data circulates around one really important question, and that is, how should we measure sustainability? The answer to this question has changed quite a bit over the years, but we historians don't just look at change over time. We also look at how ideas have had sticking power and continue to inform our concerns today. So my work specifically looks at attempts to define and measure sustainability from the late 19th century all the way through into the early 21st century. But I want to highlight two big moments that may inform your food choices today, or even this larger debate that I was mentioning, this bovine debate. So the first emerged in the early 20th century, between 1900 and 1910, for those of you in the room who like specific dates. At this time, sustainability was defined as this: efficient use of energy. To bring this into perspective, the scientists I study from this time worried about feeding a growing human population as resources seem to be more finite and they seem to be becoming more scarce. And in their attempts to figure out the best way to use these limited resources, scientists spent a lot of time measuring them, including how food was used in bodies through the calculation of calories. And the idea of calories in particular, and how they could help with measuring sustainability is particularly interesting to me because we still use and see calorie counts on a lot of our packaging today. And many of these numbers are actually based on experiments and equations that were developed during this early 20th century moment. But the idea of using calories to build a sustainable system did not just apply to humans. Speaking to energy use, scientists considered cattle quite efficient creatures for converting inedible parts of plants into desirable beef and milk for the larger population. And they used these respiration calorimeters, one of them is pictured here on this slide, to make these calculations. And the end goal was to get the most out of the available energy of any kind of product, particularly plant products. So a chart like this, I think, illustrates this pretty well in the sense that if our animals eat the waste, so the waste is up here, of these plant products, and then we in turn eat these animals, we're getting the most out of this wheat product in the case of this chart here. For this time, this was efficiency, and thus it was the more sustainable system in the long run. But this narrative did, as many narratives that are told by data, it had its consequences. And these calculations did render cattle much more like machines or factories than living organisms. So this went on to inform popular understandings of livestock, and it still affects how farmers think about and work with animals today. So this is just one model of sustainability that developed over 100 years ago and still informs how we engage with animal-based proteins today. Well, let's fast forward a few decades. As a different take on sustainability began to form. So by the 1960s, ecological balance started to better define food systems, and historians credit a few different flashpan moments for this, but Rachel Carson's 1962 Silent Spring might be something that most of us are familiar with in the room. And the way sustainability was measured in these cases was increased attention to the mitigation of pollutants within these resources. So when speaking to the larger bovine debate, especially today, greenhouse gas emissions are at the forefront of everyone's minds, and you can definitely see it through popular headlines from various newspapers. These are just a few. But these findings are covered, that are covered by these articles are based on calculations made by larger data inventories, like EDGAR, which was created by the European Commission in the 1990s. These inventories continue to help create charts, like this one, that illustrate the problematic place of beef for the environment. But just as these issues that were focusing on calorie counts in the early 20th century were problematic, these specific data sets come with their own challenges. So incomplete data, for instance, can help perpetuate false comparisons, such as the idea that livestock farming creates more emissions than the transportation sector. This claim was based on an FAO report from 2006 that really meticulously calculated livestock emissions in great detail through the supply chain for livestock in particular, but then did not do the same kind of analysis for the transportation sector. So when they were making this comparison, it was actually an incomplete one and it made it inaccurate. So that's one problem that can happen when thinking about how data is being interpreted. Different data can also tell different stories about livestock emissions. So this is illustrated particularly well in this collection of maps that's created by Penn State University. And these maps are created by different types of inventory systems, including EDGAR. While one map, for instance, might speak to how many different farms equally contribute to livestock emissions in the United States, if you're using that data differently and through a different inventory, you get a very different story that might be more focused on a certain kind of farming or a certain geographic region. And these national and international analyses don't even account for the day-to-day changes that farmers are actually making on the ground. So speaking with some of the scientists that develop these programs, they're sometimes having to make wider generalizations to fit a given equation and sometimes missing the smaller marks that farmers are really trying to implement on the ground. So what can we take from this? Returning to these two visuals and thinking about our food choices today and why we make them, I think it's important to bear in mind that data is collected and interpreted with specific ideas of sustainability in mind. These ideas have a context, they also have a history, and both can tell us different stories about the role that cattle play in our food systems today. Thank you for your attention.